The Where Our Minds Wander podcast may contain sensitive content and explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Greetings, fellow wanderers, to the places our minds wander.
Where strange lights speed beyond reason across a clear night sky.
The house at the end of the road where disembodied voices whisper and strange noises make the living shiver.
Lurking shadows hiding on the edge of the woods just outside your back door.
Odd, true events throughout time that lead you down the rabbit hole. I'm Wes.
And I'm Beth.
And this is Where Our Minds Wander. Hello and welcome to Our Minds Wander, all you fellow wanderers. I'm Wes, and that's my wife and co-host Beth.
Hello, everyone.
So, it's been feeling a lot like an early fall with the temps in like the 60s and 70s this week in upstate New York. And it always gets me excited to go to the Apple Orchard Bakery. And we did just that today.
Apple cider donuts is the best smell in the world.
There's just something so comforting about apple cider and donuts, So, I bought a dozen cider donuts today and a gallon of apple cider.
So, how many of those donuts do you have left out of that dozen that you bought?
Oh, maybe 3.
Oh my God. You ate 9 donuts?
Yeah, don't judge me. They were delicious. It seemed to go so quick. So, you got some goodies too today when we were at the Apple Orchard, huh?
I'm all about the cinnamon sugar.
Yeah, I can't eat anything that's jelly or cream filled or it's got cinnamon on it. There's no way. My palate just can't handle that.
Mine can.
I saw, and you're laughing at me, but how many donuts do you have left?
Like 10.
Oh, well, wow. You win. And if you haven't tried apple cider and Kraken rum, it's God's nectar.
You're going to have a stomach ache. All this apple cider and donuts and...
Yeah, but it's going to be well worth it. So, enough of that already about our trip to the Apple Orchard and my donut consumption. Where did your mind wander this week?
Well, you and I talk all the time about places we want to visit, right? And I just keep adding to my list.
Yeah, that you do.
I do, because I love places with history, as I'm sure all our listeners know by now. But I also like the quirkier, artsy type places that may not necessarily have a long history, but they're interesting to look at and they make me think in some way. So the topic I'm covering tonight is both of those things mixed together. It's some history, but it's also some quirkiness. And it's kind of funny you mentioned the apple orchard because, well, you'll see the connection in a bit.
Alrighty.
A gnarled maple tree, knobby and bent with age, sits almost on the steps leading to a brick building. The tree is so massive and yet so straggly that the building fades in the background. Hanging from its branches are purple, silver, and red beaded necklaces, like the ones people throw during Mardi Gras. Nestled in the crook of the branches are dolls, some store-bought and some handcrafted out of aluminum foil and twigs. At the base of the imposing maple, small trinkets, single playing cards, and other offerings sit. And there's the hand-painted sign that reads, Witches Welcome. This is the Witches Tree of Louisville, Kentucky.
Oh, cool.
It's so cool looking. Witches have long been depicted as having strong ties to trees. Artwork going back hundreds of years shows witches congregating beneath tree branches, circling the trunk in some sort of practice. Witches' brooms are bent branches. The Malleus Maleficarum, that treatise on finding and ending witchcraft, even claims witches would hide the virile member of men in nests placed in trees. So, why is there a witch's tree in a busy section of Louisville?
I don't know, but I'm sure you're going to tell us.
If experience has taught us anything. The legend surrounding the tree dates back to 1889, when a coven of witches allegedly met at this tall maple each night to cast spells and brew potions. In December of that year, the local government decided to cut down the tree, I presume to get rid of the nightly meetings. The city claimed they wanted to use the tree as the maypole in the next year's maypole celebration. The witches, understandably alarmed, warned city officials not to chop down the tree, or a terrible calamity would ensue. The city cut it down anyway.
Of course they did.
As the tree hit the ground, the witches left town, but not before they warned everyone who would listen that they'd be sorry. In 1890, a tornado destroyed the city. As it was dissipating, a bolt of lightning hit the remaining tree stump. Miraculously, a brand new maple began to grow, and is now the tree that still stands there today. The Louisville locals have been making offerings to the tree ever since. Some, I'm sure, out of curiosity, but some, I'm sure, out of faith that the tree has some sort of cosmic powers. So, looking at that tree, it got me thinking about witches' trees and the lore behind them. We live in a rural area, and there are farms all around us.
Yes, there is.
And there's something about seeing a lone tree in a field that I just think is inherently creepy. And for some reason, I always think, witch's tree, every time I spot one. So there's one road that we travel quite often, and it has this tree by itself in the middle of a field. It's kind of scraggly and bent, and every single time we go by it, I can't help it. I just immediately think witch's tree. And I mentioned it to friends once to see if either of them had ever heard of it. And they were both like, no. But, they know I'm kind of a history buff and kind of a dork, and they let me explain what I was talking about. And I figured this idea has to be from some sort of fiction I read or some movie I watched that I can't quite remember. So I decided to look up why there are so many farmers' fields with a single tree. And in this case, it's pretty logical. The one tree provided a shaded spot for a farmer to rest, for the horses to rest, etc. But what about the other just creepy trees? I mean, we've all seen them. We're either walking in the woods or we're in a cemetery, and there are just certain trees that creep us out.
Yeah, they just stand right out.
Yeah.
They capture your attention, and you're thinking, this just doesn't fit in.
It doesn't look right. So, of course, I've heard the legend that people killed for being witches, quote, witches, were buried beneath trees because the roots keep their souls trapped underground. I've seen plenty of shows with this witch tree idea, perpetuated in all variations. Some are built on facts, some are just wildly imagined. So perhaps that's what's behind my innate reaction. But then that got me thinking as well. How central were trees to the historical idea of witchcraft? So according to historicuk.com, there are many. If I covered all of them, it would take hours, but here's just 3. So blackthorn. Apparently, up to as recently as the 1940s in the UK, anyone seen with a walking stick made of blackthorn wood was suspected of being a witch. If the person carrying it pointed it at a pregnant animal, the animal would miscarry. If it was pointed at crops, the crops would die. But at the same time, blackthorn staffs are an emblem of holding a position of civic office in parts of Britain. So that's interesting.
That is interesting. Boy, you wouldn't want him to point that stick at you, would you?
Well, I mean, that got me thinking again that, it's intention. So, I mean, if you have malice towards someone and you point at them with, I don't know, you've got a bucket of popcorn in your hand and you motion at them, then the bucket of popcorn could become a symbol of a threat. But I also believe in the healing properties of certain plants and the idea of using things from the earth to heal your wounds and soften your skin and soothe your stomach. So I think in a lot of these cases, historically, Certain properties or beliefs were tied to certain objects like blackthorn by the majority in order to ostracize the few. So the next tree is hawthorn. Also called May, hawthorn marks the beginning of summer. It is believed that if you bring hawthorn into your house before May Day, you will suffer bad luck. The first person on May Day to bring hawthorn indoors, though, will have good luck. Rowan trees figure back as far as Norse mythology, but the berries, which are small and bright orange, are incredibly poisonous if eaten raw. They're fine if they're cooked down, though. But waving raw rowan berries over a person's head could traditionally protect you from witches, if the person you were waving them over was suspected of being a witch. But what about maples, which is the type of tree in Louisville? Do they have any connection to witchcraft lore? If you just Google maple trees and witchcraft lore, you will see half a dozen sites dedicated to all the many, many properties associated with the maple tree.
Really? Because we have a lot of them here.
Yeah, it's everything from, you eat the seeds to find love, or you can use the wood in spells about art and beauty and abundance, and wands made out of maple are often used in healing rituals. So whether the Louisville lore is true or not, tourists and locals alike make a point to come see the tree. Some come to take pictures, some to add to the collection of eclectic offerings. But regardless, it's a pretty cool-looking tree and not one I would want to see if I was standing alone in a field. But what about an entire forest of witches' trees? England's New Forest has several trees that have been etched into over the last 500 years. These etchings are called arborglyphs, and some may be as old as Shakespearean.
That's so cool.
So cool. The most common type of arborglyph found in the New Forest is called the King's Mark. It's an arrowhead-shaped symbol that was used by the Royal Navy to tag beeches and oaks that they claimed for shipbuilding. The trees bearing the mark still exist because Great Britain switched from wood to iron and steel for its warships in the early 19th century, and those trees didn't make the cut. Get it?
Wow.
Told you I was a dork.
You are a dork. Carry on.
I know. Some of the other arborglyphs are of birds, houses, and human faces. But a number of trees in the New Forest are marked with concentric circles known as witches' marks, which were probably intended to ward off evil spirits. There are other witches' marks, like the double V symbol on the trees as well. Researchers believe this arborglyph represented the Virgin Mary, and they have been found all over England, not just the New Forest, and not just on trees. They've been located in caves and on barns, for example, and some of them are incredibly old. We're talking 1500s all the way up to the 1800s. There's a really cool online gallery you can search through to see several different carvings in the various New Forest trees. And I'll make sure that it's in our show notes because it's definitely worth looking at. It's really cool.
Yeah, that seems something to delve deeper into.
Yeah, I was at the New Forest several years ago. We drove through. We didn't stop. But I mean, it's a forest that's been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. It was the king's land. He owned it. It was illegal to hunt in the king's forest. You could be fined if you killed anything in the king's forest. And I remember there were wild horses that lived there.
Oh, yes. I remember you telling about this trip.
Yeah. And it was just so beautiful just to see these horses just in the mist and hanging out in this forest. I did not know about the carvings in the trees, though. If I did, I would have stopped.
Yeah. I've seen quite a bit on the King's Forest. It's pretty cool.
It's really cool.
Well, then. That was pretty interesting.
Thanks. It was no donut, but... Do you want another one? You want me to go get you one? You good?
Yeah, I'm fine. I'll save my other 3 for tomorrow. And the apple orchard's only a hop, skip, and a jump away from here anyway, so thanks for your concern. Hey, did you know? When the Pirates of the Caribbean ride opened in Disneyland in the 1960s, many of the skeletons were real. The art department wasn't able to make fake skeletons appear realistic enough, so Disneyland reached out to UCLA, who donated what they had. Don't worry, they've all been replaced by fakes in the years since, or have they? Rumors persist that one skull still used in the ride is the real deal. Who'da thunk it?
So where did your mind wander to this week?
Well, tonight I'm talking about the Lady of the Ring.
Ooh, okay.
Lurgan, North Ireland is a centuries-old industrial town rich with its own complex history. But Shankill Cemetery, which lies beyond the main street, is the setting for my story tonight. And what a chilling tale it is. I'm talking about the woman who lived once, but was buried twice.
Ooh.
The earliest church in Shankill Cemetery was built in 1306. During the 18th century, many paupers and victims of the plague were buried there in unmarked graves. Fearing that reopening these graves would release the plague back into the air, officials decreed that the graves should never be redug again. In 1834, the threat of body snatching was so prevalent that two men built a watchtower in the cemetery, and for a small fee, families could be assured that their loved ones would not be taken in the middle of the night for medical research.
Jeez.
So today, the Shankill Cemetery is closed to new burials, but the existing ones go back as far as the 1600s. It's actually a really cool place. Lots of old stones and beautiful statues. But there's one grave in particular that tends to stand out more than the rest. It's an old headstone, so old in fact that metal braces have been bent around it to hold it intact. There is no visible inscription left on the stone itself, but a small, more modern plaque has been added to the bottom that reads, Margorie McCall, lived once, buried twice.
Okay.
Margorie McCall was a young wife in 1695. Unfortunately, she became ill with a fever, and believing her to have passed on, her family bereaved and held a wake and buried her. Grave robbing was not just a problem in the 1800s, but even far earlier. And one night, right after Marjorie died, two grave robbers crept into the cemetery and began to dig. Instead of choosing any of the other newly filled in plots, they decided to choose Marjorie's plot and were greedily excited to see the fine, expensive ring still on her finger. No matter how hard they tried, though, they couldn't remove it. Perhaps worried that they were taking too long and would be caught, they resorted to cutting her entire finger off.
Oh, man.
They barely began when Marjorie awoke from the dead, her eyes flying open, and the terrified grave robbers took off.
Oh my gosh. Was she buried alive?
Yes, Marjorie, it appeared, had been buried alive.
That's terrifying.
She stood up, dusted herself off, and returned home. When she knocked on the front door of her house, John, her shocked husband, fainted at her feet.
Can you blame him?
Not at all.
Hello, honey, I'm home.
Marjorie lived on for many years, even bearing more children, and at the actual end of her life, she was buried again in Shankill Cemetery. It sounds somewhat plausible. In fact, fear of being buried alive was a huge concern for many people throughout history. The problem is, there's very little proof, if any, to this particular tale.
Wait. It's not true?
No.
Come on. Seriously?
Sorry, dear. It's a tale, but we will lead on to more.
You totally had me going.
So the Public Records Office has records of 9 Margorie McCalls in Lurgan, 3 of whom were married to a John McCall. However, Shankill Parish has no records of the birth of a Margorie McCall at all. Neither are the records of either of her burials, nor do they have a record of her marriage to John. So when I was describing her gravestone, maybe what I should have said is that the stone never had any dates inscribed on it, because the stone is 100% there as a tourist attraction.
Okay. Why?
Well, because the Lady of the Ring legend is so well known that Schenkel Cemetery chose to pay homage to it in a unique way.
Oh.
Other versions of Margorie McCall, Lady of the Ring story go into the greater detail, saying that John had tried to remove her ring before she was buried, but the illness had caused her fingers to swell so badly that he couldn't remove it. Some claim that when John answered the door and saw his dead wife standing there, covered in dirt and blood, he didn't just faint, he died from the shock. The irony, of course, was that John was buried in the plot Marjorie had escaped from. She remarried in this version and had many more children before being reburied in the cemetery many years later. If the tale sounds familiar to you, that could be because, although it is widely known and retold across Northern Ireland, it may have not originated there. Or if it did, the tale spread to other countries and cultures, and new local figures became the Marjorie character. For example, in Cologne, France, the Lady of the Ring died of the plague in 1357, and her name was Richmondus von Odok. In England, the Lady of the Ring story gained popularity in the 18th century as well, but she went by at least 6 different names.
Wow, the tale really got around then.
That it did. In the first version, she was supposedly Lady Anne Edgecombe. 100 years later, in newer retellings, it was her descendant, Emma Edgecombe. In between all this, some of the other names tied to this gruesome story were Anna of Bentley, Catherine Wyndham, Hannah Goodman, and Constance Whitney. The names also changed as the tale moved to Scotland as well, or at least the surnames. Marjorie Elphinstone, who passed away in 1622, was the wife of the Master of Work to the Crown of Scotland, so I would imagine she was a well-known woman in her time. The Lady of the Ring story involving her goes like this. Marjorie, or Mary as she's sometimes referred to in the tale, fell ill and was merely in a trance-like state and not deceased as her family thought, and she was buried alive. A sexton, or which is otherwise known as a church custodian, went to her grave to steal her rings. He too tried to cut off her ring, and she awoke screaming, and the rest of the tale follows suit, with her and her husband continuing to live on together for many more years. Margaret Erskine, mistress of King James V of Scotland, is also named in the Scottish versions. But the tale crosses even more borders. An ethnologist in 1920 concluded that there were 19 separate cities in Germany that all claimed that they had a Lady of the Ring. Of course, all 19, including Hamburg and Dresden, firmly believed that their lady was the true lady. So why did the Lady of the Ring story resonate across so many different cultures? Well, for 2 reasons. One, as I had mentioned, grave robbing was very common and a fear for many families, especially those who had wealth. And 2, being buried alive wasn't as far-fetched as we'd like to believe.
Right. Because aren't there grave bells in some cemeteries? There's like the bell where the chain goes all the way into the coffin. So if the person was buried alive, they could ring the bell to let people know. And there were other fail-safes, I think, too, for coffins during that time period.
Right. And there were lots of contraptions being done at that time because of the fear of being buried alive. And, there were other things being constructed because of the grave robbers, like cages over graves and things like that. But that's really an entire topic for another show that we could delve into sometime.
Yeah. I didn't even think about the cages, like why those were there. I had no clue. But as soon as you said it, I was like, oh, that makes sense why I've seen those.
There were plenty of actual documented cases in which people were buried alive, but perhaps none are as ironic as the case of Thomas A. Kempis. Thomas A. Kempis was born in Kempen in the Rhineland in 1380. He was a devotional writer and teacher and is probably most well known for the writing The Imitation of Christ. which I guess is one of the most best-known Christian books ever written on devotion. He was almost 90 years old when he had passed away in 1471. Not long after his burial, the church began to look closely at his work and his life, and they decided that he should be sainted. It's not a quick process, and one of the steps involved exhuming his remains. When they removed the lid of his coffin, they found something rather disturbing that frankly has become the hallmark of many horror stories. But this time, it was honestly real. The underside of the coffin lid was covered in fingernail claw marks. Not only that, but they found splinters embedded under Thomas's fingernails.
And this one is real?
Yes.
Okay, you're not going to tell me it's fake?
No.
Then that's totally horrific. And I don't even want to think about it. It's horrifying. I think there's a reason that it's become such a horror movie staple. I mean, it's almost cliche at this point how many horror movies and TV shows have being buried alive as part of their story. But I think that for 99% of human beings, it's a bona fide fear. And that's why it's in so many TV shows and horror movies.
Well, here's the irony. Not only was Thomas actually buried alive, but once the church saw the evidence that he was, they decided he didn't deserve to even be a saint.
Why?
Well, to the 15th century church officials, the scratches on the coffin were evidence that Thomas hadn't willingly accepted his fate. And that was proof that he cared more about his physical world and physical body than he did about faith in God's will.
Okay, so if they hadn't exhumed him, they would never know. And I mean, I don't know a thing about the canonization process, but why would they exhume the bodies? Like, what were they looking for?
Well, a couple things actually, but mostly it was because once someone was deemed a saint, their bones were often offered as relics to other churches.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Because I actually saw quite a lot of those in churches in Italy, especially finger bones.
Yes, that's true. And I find it quite disturbing. They thought he was worthy of becoming a saint, but yet when they exhumed him and they'd seen that, he had scratched the lid to get out, that all of a sudden he wasn't worthy to become a saint. And to me, that's quite disturbing because it's your natural fight, or flight. He didn't have any control of that. Anybody suffocating, that's the response they would get.
They would see it as he fought his fate, that if he was truly worthy of being a saint, that he would have just accepted it as the will of God and not fought without understanding.
Right, without having the understanding that this is the body's natural response.
Right.
That he had no choice.
He had no control over how his body was responding to the situation.
But perhaps they could go back and deem him a saint now. I mean, if somebody wanted to step back in and say, oh, hey, with what we know today in modern medicine, that they could deem him a saint now? Perhaps.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know how it all works.
Me neither. I guess that about wraps it up for this episode, all you fellow wanderers.
Yeah, and I hope everybody has a good weekend, and we'll see you all next week.
Yeah, we'll see you for an all-new episode next week of Where Our Minds Wander. Take care. See you soon.
Thank you for joining us. We look forward to traveling with you again to the places where our minds wander.
If you like what you heard, please take a moment and provide us with a 5-star rating and a comment. It really helps us move up the list so people can find us. See you next week for an all-new episode of Where Our Minds Wander.